Alright, YouTube, I thought I'd enlighten people about the topic of demonic possession, because there's a lot of misconceptions on this topic going around, especially on YouTube, with all of these people claiming, they were possessed by a Ouija board, they were possessed by, studying witchcraft or watching Harry Potter, any of a million different things that they claim causes demonic possession. I would like to point out the actual meaning of the word demon, which I've pointed out on other videos, but I'll point it out again here as well as cultural conceptions of what possession means, where it roots, just these different myths about the subject that people think are true, that are based on pop culture. So first, I would like to address one of the major myths, Ouija boards. That you can be possessed by using a Ouija board. Wrong. You cannot be possessed by a Ouija board. Think about it logically for a minute before you put a bunch of emotion into it. Do you honestly think that the tens of millions of Ouija boards in the world, little cardboard board games made by Parker Brothers, are actually a demonic tool that allows you to commune with the spirits of the deceased or the damned entities of hell? If this makes sense to you, that would be true, you probably shouldn't bother continuing to watch the video, because you're not going to understand any of the things that I'm going to say, which are purely true and academic. You will choose to believe your pop culture lies. But I can tell you before you shut the video off where the idea of a Ouija board causing possession comes from. It comes from a movie from 1973 that almost everybody has heard of, but many people in modern times do not watch. Particularly Christians will not watch this movie because of their abject fear of the topic of the devil. It's from The Exorcist. The most popular horror film ever created. Of course, the basic storyline is the girl gets possessed by a Ouija board and has to be exorcised by a pair of priests. That's where that story comes from. It's now ingrained into pop culture because that movie scared so many people, and you've got to understand, the people who were, in their teens and 20s and the 70s, they're your parents. They were the baby boomers. These are the people now that tell you all of these scary stories at night to keep you away from witchcraft because they want you to be a good Christian. That's the truth. That's the pure, unadulterated truth that cannot possibly be denied. Of course, there are probably people who thought you could use Ouija boards for magical purposes before that. The hippies were all into that sort of stuff. It never worked. I've used Ouija boards. They don't do anything. The planchette's not going to move on its own. It's not going to suddenly burst into flames or go flying through the air. That simply doesn't happen. They wouldn't... If they were that successful for an occult purpose, every single occult person on Earth, and there are tens of millions of them too, would have one of these. They wouldn't just be lying in people's attics, unused for years, if they were really that cool. Kids like to talk to imaginary friends on them, make up weird stories, and it freaks their parents out. That's the truth. So let's look at the actual word demon before we get any further on that subject. The word demon is Greek, as I've pointed out before. It originally was spelled with an A. It was D-A-E-M-O-N, daimon. The original Greek term daimon, which informed the translation of the Bible into Greek, which is where we now get our modern Bible from, has nothing to do with the idea of demons that we think of today. That is, these entities from hell or the netherworld or, the world below in some way. They come out of volcanoes or something. Has nothing to do with that. The original term meant a spiritual essence. It was an inspirational spirit. Literally speaking, a spirit which inspires. A writer who was suffering from writer's block but suddenly got an inspiration to write would have been said to have been possessed by a demon by the ancient Greeks. Likewise, it was more seen as being possessed by either a natural animal spirit, nymphs or dryads or whatever, or being possessed by a ghost of your ancestors. And this is a common theme throughout ancient cultures. Their idea of what we would consider, we would look at what they are talking about and say that's a form of possession by demonic forces. What a Christian or a Westerner in general would see is that generally in more ancient or in third world sort of pagan animalistic cultures is seen as being inspired, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, depends on the culture and situation and the outcome, by the spirits of the ancestors or by certain animal totems, various entities like this. Now, fundamentalist Christians will say, well, all of that pagan mumbo-jumbo, that's demons. They worship demons. Well, you've got to understand, though, the linguistic term comes from Greek and has absolutely nothing to do with that. The more appropriate term, and I don't know the term because I haven't studied Hebrew, would be the Hebrew term for these various tempting spirits, or this singular, the devil tempting spirit, which is actually multiple spirits but has been lumped into a singular over time by Christians. This tempting spirit of Judaism was also not completely malevolent. No, it had a good side. It was sent down by God to tempt people, deliberately so that the holy would reap rewards. The idea was he would send this spirit to people he knew were probably going to resist the temptation. Thus they proved themselves worthy of greater power and goods and wealth. That's the devil. That's the head demon, although what we call the devil in Christendom, what the Christians call the devil, not we like me, but what the devil is considered by the Western world in general, is actually a plural which is related to the Hebrew spirit, the tempting spirits, the ones that went around to tempt people to do bad just so that they would do good and get rewarded for it. We see a similarity with Islamic culture, although it's technically taken from Arabic paganism because the references date to long before Islam was invented, of jinn, these creatures that roam the desert. Occasionally they'll possess people, but they are not malevolent either. They can be converted to Islam by a proper exorcism ritual. We see, for instance, in certain Amazonian tribes, they will deliberately ingest certain hallucinogens so that they will be possessed by spirits. They feel that it gives them the ability to prophesy future events. They will allow themselves, the shaman will be possessed, and babble in, obviously, nonsense words, no one can understand it. The other priest or shaman or leader or whoever will then translate the meaning of those words, or the shaman will write it down and then translate it when he's no longer under the influence of such things that he snuffed up his nose or smoked or otherwise imbibed. So you can see that the term demon means different things to different cultures. They're all similar entities. However, they've been misconstrued. That's because the original proto-humans living in the Mesopotamian region and in other similar regions which spread out, we have to assume fairly rapidly, given that they were at the height of their power a mere 5,000 years ago, and now the world has 7 billion people in it. We have to assume that people traveled more quickly than perhaps even archaeologists give them credit. This seems to have spread throughout most cultures in the world from a progenitorial stock of people who believed that certain cosmic forces were capable in physically interceding in people's lives. I will point out one final point. Look at third world cultures versus civilized, quote-unquote, industrialized Western cultures. Where is exorcism and possession more common? Third world cultures. Why is that? Because in Western cultures, in advanced civilizations, we understand that most of the things which a third world individual would consider a form of possession are mental illnesses. Somebody who's speaking in tongues, rolling around on the floor, jumping up and down the bed, it can be chalked up to the kid is just misbehaving. The kid is mentally ill. The adult is mentally ill or misbehaving. They got poisoned by some psychedelic substance, maybe. Maybe they've got brain damage, a tumor. Any of these things could be responsible. Epilepsy. Any of these things could be responsible. I will note, in certain African tribes that believe in possession, they don't have a term for schizophrenia. They believe that it's a form of demonic intercession in a person's life. How do they treat it? Their rite of exorcism involves certain plants wrapped around the head after the head is shaved. What's the significance here? The exorcism works almost 100 times out of 100. Why? Because those plants have chemicals in them which suppress schizophrenia. It's not because the priest chants and waves a bongo, it's because the chemicals in the plant are treating the actual condition. But they look and they call it spiritual, and they say, look, the exorcism worked. The rite of exorcism, why do you think the Catholic Church almost never talks about it, or even bothers to teach the priests the actual proper way to do it? It's just written in a book from the 1800s. That's about as early as you get. Any older than that, they just fall apart. Probably dates back to before 1000 AD, but they don't perform exorcisms anymore. Why? Because people don't get possessed. People in Western cultures rarely complain of being possessed because they don't believe it's so. Why would demons just happen to preferentially inhabit people in the third world who don't know any better than to think that a mental illness is possession? It's absolute nonsense. It's rubbish that anyone believes this is possible. You cannot be possessed by spiritual entities. No, you can't be possessed. They don't exist. Demons aren't real. Why do people have such a problem letting go of the idea that demons or the devil exists? But they have no problem saying that goblins aren't real. There's the same amount of evidence that they exist. You know, goblins... My fuse box got tripped. A goblin got it. The tree fell down on the house. A goblin must have sawn it off. Lawn gnomes have caused my plants to die. These things make just as much sense. These are irrational explanations for easily rationalized phenomena. Natural disasters were often seen as divine intervention in the ancient world. They believed in thousands and thousands of these mythical creatures we no longer believe in. The only ones we retain are the ones that are co-opted by some religious movement. But as I pointed out, the actual term demon doesn't even mean what people say it means. It's not an English word, it's a Greek word, which has a Jewish meaning that's informed by paganism. It's the most confused term you could... I've pointed out the same thing about Satan, Lucifer, the devil, hell, Gehenna, Sheol. They're all so intermixed, they no longer even have a valid meaning. They have no similarity to the original words whatsoever. These are things people need to understand, because this is truth. And generally, absolute truth can't be known in many cases. But when you're dealing with an abstract human concept, you can say, yes, at some point this word meant this because we've got it written down. It's an abstract term. We can derive absolute truth from it. The absolute truth is demons are Greek mythical figures with half a dozen different meanings lumped into them that nobody even understands